So what I had in today's class was more about the practical session as to what all things we can do. Like in last class, whatever we discussed, according to that, in today's class we have the actual implementation, etc. So let me start. I'll close everything and use Control Shift F4 for that. And once you're done, see, this is a Spring example project which is in my local. And see, the thing is that all my projects going forward which I've used is Maven. So the pom.xml is there, and in the pom.xml I have all the necessary configurations for making it a Spring project. So basically we need all the dependencies. So here I have the appropriate dependency. We have the Spring and Spring context. So many of the things which we use in Spring, not all of them lie in one jar. So depending on their project structure, if some other class is required, we'll have to import it. The only thing which we have to make sure is that we use the same version uh, for all the Spring parts, because otherwise there might be some compatibility issues. So that's why we should use the same version. So that is one thing which we need to take care of. After that, the second most important thing in the case of Spring, and since I have only taught the XML way, because annotations would be pretty much simpler if you understand uh, one, like in one way. So let's see how we do it in the case of application context. I mean, using XMLs. So here we have this application context.xml. So there is no need it's not mandatory that name it as application context.xml. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it abhishek.xml, shadow.xml, because it hardly matters. And in this particular XML, the tag name starts with beans, it ends with beans, and then you define all the appropriate bean. So one of the beans, if you see here, like this ID is very important. This is ID by which you'll be referring it from your code. Okay. Now once you have an ID defined, like say hello bean we have defined here, we also have to make sure that we mention the class name for which this particular bean stands for. So here I have come with com.main.abhishek.hello world. So if you click here, it takes you to the actual hello world programs, which has name, and then you have set name, and I have one method also, welcome. So here I'm trying to welcome, along with the name. So this is one of my methods. So if you look at this particular class, it is just Pojo class. And when I say Pojo, I mean pure old Java object. So it's a class, it has some attributes and few methods to access those attributes. So this is what a Pojo class is, and the bean is a way to access it. Now we have defined it here. Similarly, we have another definition of bean. Similarly, we have a definition for construct for another bean. But the only difference here is that we have put a constructor arg. So there are different ways to instantiate a bean, and we can have this property setting, or we can have this constructor arg. So let's see the actual method, and then we'll understand it a bit more. See, this is my main class. Now I always have to run it. Now if you see here, we are giving the path. In last class we were discussing about application context and bean factory. So we are using application context class to load the Spring IOC container. Okay. So when I say Spring IOC container, it's inversion of control container, which basically means that it contains all the beans which is there for that particular IOC. So in our case, this is application context.xml. All the beans which are here, all the instances which will get created, that will be part of that particular container. So when I say container, it's not like you have some different place, different placeholder or server, something of that sort. Container can be anything. If you have a map which has all the ID names and the corresponding instances, it's a container. So it's just a way to say that there is a way in which your data, your beans are stored. I mean the live objects references are stored, and that's what it's called as container. Okay. Now if you see here this app, now what we're doing is we're loading this application context, and from this application context we're trying to get this bean. So we are trying to get here this hello bean. Okay. Now this hello bean is the bean which is mentioned here. Okay. Now we could have there are other beans as well, we could have used it the way in which we have used here, but for now let's just comment it out. Okay. So this is what we have for now. Let's run it. Now see here, we are getting inside constructor welcome Abhishek. Okay. Now what is important is, let's go back and see here where we have, this is the welcome method, right? Welcome Abhishek. And then the other thing which you're getting is inside constructor, right? Now where do we have this inside constructor and why it is getting printed? Uh, any guesses, Shala? Where do we have this inside constructor? Okay, so the thing is that, see, there's one more bean, customer. Okay, and you see all the beans are defined in the application context.xml. So you have hello bean, you have address, you have customer bean. Okay, now the thing is that if you do not give how your beans should be instantiated, then all the beans are instantiated whenever you are trying to load the application context.xml for the first time. So here if you see this app.java, and we'll go below. So here in this particular line, we are trying to load the application context.xml, and when we load it at that time, all the beans which are defined in this particular XML will get loaded up in the inversion of control container, in the IOC container. Now if it gets loaded up there, then it means that all of them would be instantiated. This means that in one way or the other all the constructors would get called, or maybe the initialization methods, etc. So if that is the case, then I mean so if that is the case, since all of them will get loaded, so in this particular line itself you will get any logs which are there in the constructor, and one of the logs which I have put purposely in the constructor is this one, inside constructor. This is the one which gets called. Okay, and that's why we get this particular part. Okay, now that answers this question which I asked, so that why this is coming first. And after that, once the bean gets loaded, I have put obj.welcome. This is a hello world object, so we're doing a welcome. So this particular method which is welcome here gets executed, and you're seeing the output here. So this is what Spring Bean is all about. Now if you see here, the idea, now if you see here, you'll see one more thing, and that is that in this app class I have not created a new object. Okay, so if without Spring someone would have asked you to do it, how would you have done it? The idea would have been to go here and use new operator and do it, right? Now the thing is that is perfectly fine for small applications, but in big applications most of the times you do not use this new operator. The reason being that sometimes you use a factory pattern, etc., to come up with the actual objects. So there is a way to get it. You do not directly just create a new object and start working on it. Sometimes you're using a singleton object, which means that for the entire application you only have one instance of the object being used. So you have a class which actually ensures that whenever you are trying to create a particular instance, I mean only one instance, whatever was created first, is getting returned. So that is one of the items which which Spring takes care of. Now that's why we are not using this new operator. Now coming back to here, by default you can ask, like say since we have this singleton and which means that only one instance would get created, and how is that ensured in Spring? Because here we are just doing context and then we are getting it like this. So every time, like say again, if I run it, I load it again, will that constructor get called again or not? Any answer, Shala? Like say if I create a new object like this. So we saw here that when we were running it, we saw inside constructor got called because we were initializing all the objects, right? So will this create a new object or not? Or does this create new object or not? Can you tell me? Shala, are you there? Shala, Aarti, are you guys able to hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Any answers?
Only one object should get created, so I don't think the second one will be.
Okay. So yes, but the thing is that it will create two objects. Let's see why. First, we'll run it. See, it got called two times, right? Now, why it got called two times? It got called two times. It means that two objects got created. What is the reason behind it? The reason behind it is simple. Now, the reason behind it is simple. The thing is that uh, whatever is the scope of a Spring Bean, that is defined per IOC container. Okay, and when you call something like this, right, it creates an IOC container in the sense that there is a different object instantiated, or there is a different way to hold the beans data for you, and all of those beans would be associated with this particular context. Okay, now if you execute this one again, right, this means that a new context has been created. So this is like creating one instance of IOC container. This is like creating second instance of IOC container. Okay, so whether you have one instance or two instances of the same bean, that is only relevant with respect to the IOC container and not with respect to anything else. So here, since we have one IOC container, it got loaded once, you created it. When you do context or get bean, hello bean, it does not create it again, right? Why? Because we have not specified it here clearly, but the default scope of a Spring Bean is singleton. It means that it will create only one instance. So when you loaded it, it created, and every time you try to access it using context or get bean, the same instance will get returned. But if you want to change that default behavior, you can go ahead and do that. So let's see how. So when you want to create a new object, every time you access that particular bean, you have to define the scope as prototype. Now if you go and run it, default is singleton, yes. See, yes, but how do I ensure that it is getting called twice? So what we'll do is we'll add a constructor here. We see here for this particular instance, context.getBean, the hello world constructor is called. Again, when you're trying to call it again, this again the constructor is called. So new object is created every time. Okay, but if you remove the scope, and by default since it is singleton, or you can mention it also singleton, it means that only one instance will get used. So ideally this should not appear when you run it again. See, only once it came. Hello world constructor. So only one instance for an IOC container. But if you change the scope of the bean, it will start appearing. It will start getting called like you are doing a new operator. You are creating a new object every time you are trying to access that particular bean from the constructor. Okay. So this is how you do it for normal beans. Any questions till now?
Abhishek, what's the difference between creating the second instance for IOC and the gravestone of the second object?
Sorry, can you come again?
No, with the in the without the changing the scope when we did first, it was creating the second instance for the container.
Right. So the second instance, the thing is that everything which you do in the case of Spring is associated with one application context or a bean factory. So here this application context we are creating. So this is in a way when you do a context or get bean, it means that context object as such, which is of type application context, has a way to store all the objects for you. Okay, so whenever you are doing context.getBean, it will get an instance from there and give it to you. Okay, now there are requirements where every time you want to access a bean, it has to be a new one. You do not have to use the old object. The old object has to be discarded. If that is a requirement, okay, then you have to create the bean with the scope as prototype, not as singleton. So the meaning of prototype is that every time you try to access a bean from this particular application context, it has to be a new bean, a new object as such, because that is a requirement. So for example, say that you have a bean as customer. Now that customer bean has attributes such as first name, last name, customer ID, etc. Now everything in this particular bean is related to the customer. Now since everything is related to the customer, it belongs to one customer. Now that particular customer is it's his own personal data. So once you do context.getBean customer, you get the customer object, you work on it, you after that you call hibernate to save the data also in the DB. Now next time you say if you have a list of customers, now next time you want to load another bean and set the appropriate properties there, like the customer ID, first name, etc. Now if you're using the old object, there are chances that you might not override all the values and some of the old customer data, whatever you have set earlier, can be used for the new one. Now since that was the case, there was a chance that the data from one customer could have been mixed with the data for the other customer, right? So to avoid that, every time when you are doing context.getBean customer, you have to get a new object. So to facilitate that, the scope of the beans is defined, so that every time you access it, you get a new bean by putting scope as prototype. But if you put the scope as singleton, like say if you want to get a JDBC connection and you want to use only one connection, so it was created once, you always want to use it. So if that is the case, then you should always use singleton. So every time if you do context.getBean JDBC connection, it will always give you the same instance. It's not going to create a new instance for you. So whether you have to keep the scope as singleton or whether you have to keep the scope as prototype, that depends on the requirement. But whenever you do everything like context.getBean etc., everything is associated with one IOC container. Now the thing is that second IOC container. Now this second IOC container normally in an application is not required. So if you have an integrated web application, ideally you need this unless you have like a convoluted set of requirements where you have a web application but there is some portion which is not using that web application part in the sense that it is related to EJB, and EJB is a different from web layer. So if you have read like done some reading from your side also earlier, EAR file, Enterprise Application Archive file, is actually composed of WAR and EJBs. So WAR is basically the web application and EJB is Enterprise Java Beans. So Enterprise Java Beans, they do not use the settings which you have done for web.xml. So web.xml, there is a way to load the Spring. There are servlet context listeners etc. which load it up, but that facility is not available in the case of EJBs. So in that case, either you have to go for some other way or you have to use this kind of instance of the IOC container. So this will create a new instance, okay, so that you can refer the Spring beans there, because there is no way to refer the beans in the case of EJBs. So what and how we do it in web.xml, we're going to see when we are writing the Spring MVC application. But what we're trying to, the point which I'm trying to put here is that IOC containers second instance is not normally required. So if you want to create a second object, you do not want to create a new instance of the IOC container and then get the beans from it. The reason being, this particular call is very heavy, because whenever you load it, you have to load the entire set of files, okay, the entire set of beans. So that is going to eat up all your time, first of all. Second of all, the design principle is that there is one IOC container and all the objects should belong to that particular container, and same IOC container gives you a way to create new objects, to use the same object, and other ways to create objects. So all these things is given to you by a Spring container itself, the Spring IOC container itself. So there is no need to create a new one, and that's why you need not create a second IOC instance if you want to create a new object, okay. But ideally, in the sense that talking in pure technical perspective, if you do that, new object would get created, and if you're just doing like say welcome or anything of that sort, it's going to work. It's not going to hinder whatever you're doing, but you should not do so. Is it clear now?
Yeah, but will the content will be same in both the context?
See, the content of an application context is basically the beans which are defined here. So when you load up the first time, yes, the content would be the same. But say in that Spring context bean, this particular part, if you're setting some of the attributes and it's a singleton bean, then that will be part of only that particular IOC container. The other one, unless you do that setting there because of whatever requirements or flow you have in your code, it will be different. But when it gets loaded the first time, the beans etc. is going to be exactly the same. There is no difference.
Okay.
Okay. Now, so when you are doing context.get hello bean, so what's happening? So what's happening is that a new instance of hello world class is getting called. Why hello world class is getting called? Because of this particular definition that whenever the bean ID is hello bean, you access the class as com.main.abhishek.hello world. Okay. So this is how we define it. and we have defined the properties also here, that the name is Abhishek. Why the name is Abhishek? Because here you have one of the attributes as name as Abhishek. So whatever attributes you want to set, you can set it here. So the way in which this constructor was working was, so when you access something like this, right? So what if it is a prototype, when so it will create new object every time. So what this essentially means is that in backend, this is what happens, right? When I say backend, the Spring code, this is what it does, and afterwards it sets the properties. Why? Because the bean definition is like this. Since it is like this, the next call inside is obj dot set new, and then whatever values you are providing there. So although here you're just doing context with get bean, when it loads a bean, it checks the XML, it says that okay, it has to be an instance of this particular class, it is a singleton, so if no object is already created in the context, then only I need to create a new one, otherwise I need to use the old one, and then I need to set the following property. So in the backend, this is happening. So we are calling the default constructor of the hello world class and setting the appropriate attributes on it. But there are different ways to instantiate an object, right? What if I have this name attribute and I want to pass it during during the first call itself? I do not want to call the property. I do not want to have this particular part. I want to do it in the first call itself. I do not want to have this particular part. So that is a requirement how to do that. So let's go back to the application context XML which we have. If you see here, see this is a customer bean, and what we have done is this is a class which it stands for, and since the scope is not defined, by default the scope is singleton, and then we are going with the constructor R. So this means this is a reference to a Spring container, that it needs to call an overloaded constructor, and the index is 0 means that if the constructor accepts multiple parameters, multiple inputs, then the first one, the value of the first one should be Abhishek. If I go here and see the customer part, and if you see here, there are two ways. So one is this particular constructor, and one is this particular constructor. Now this constructor accepts a string, this constructor accepts an address. So when you write something like this, like say index is equal to 0, value is equal to Abhishek, the Spring code does a matching on the type. Okay, so it checks whether it is an address or whether it is a string. Since the value is just set in that Spring Bean XML, this application context.xml is a string value, the name is Abhishek, this particular constructor would get called. Okay, so that's why this inside constructor was getting called. Okay, so here the idea is that if you give something like this, what Spring is going to do for you is that it is going to find, I mean, let's say customer cust is equal to new customer, and it's not going to call the default constructor. It's going to call the constructor which has this value as Abhishek, and if it finds that constructor, it invokes it. If it does not find, it will throw an error, and you can see it in your logs. Okay, so, and let's go back and show you also, like say if you have this thing, right, we'll go here, we'll modify it to, just for our sake, we'll modify it to int. Okay, just to see how it works, and we'll try to load it again. See, we are getting error. Error creating bean with the name customer defined in the class path resource application context. One constructor argument specified but no matching being found. Okay, one constructor argument specified but no matching constructor found in bean. Why? Because it is trying to find a constructor which accepts string. Why? Because this is what you have given here. Okay, but here we do not find any constructor of type string because one of it you have given as integer, the other one is of type address. Okay, so the string first of all does a matching on the basis of the type and the index whatever you have given, and if it matches it calls that particular constructor. Otherwise it throws an error that it can't create the bean which you are looking for. Okay, so this is how you use a constructor. Okay, now the second thing is I've created another bean here, and that is to show you two things. If you see the same class, and it's not necessary that the same class is associated with only one bean, that is a customer bean. It depends on a requirement. If you want to access it by a different name also, you can create a new bean. So to illustrate that point and to show one more thing, I have created this particular bean here. So the bean is customer 1. Okay, the class name is same as whatever we saw earlier, com.main.abhishek.customer. And there's one more thing which I wanted to show here is this particular attribute. Okay, the attribute is lazy init is true. Guys, please go on mute. So the lazy init is true. And what lazy init stands for is lazy initialization. So what this means is that whenever the customer object is getting created, it has to only get created not when you create the context. So if you see in my earlier examples, when we were trying to load this application context, at that time all the objects are loaded up. But if that is not your requirement is that it has to get loaded up when you are trying to access it like this, then you have to put the lazy init as true, which means that do not initialize when you are creating that IOC container. Please initialize when there is a requirement for that bean, and when there is a requirement for that bean, you do context dot get bean and give the bean name. So you basically get the bean from the context when you need it, and using this lazy init as true means that at that time itself you create a new instance or give an old instance depending on the scope, but whatever you do it at that time itself. Do not work on it while loading the application context. So that is one use of this particular lazy init. Okay, now the second thing I wanted to show to you was, and in the last class also we discussed about anonymous beans, right? So here, say if the requirement is that the address bean which is there, which we have defined here, is supposed to get used only from inside the customer bean, and there is no separate existence envisioned for this particular address bean, then you can use it only from inside the customer bean. So here if you see the constructor arg, we are not referring to this particular address bean. We are defining the own bean here. So if you define your own bean here, it's a separate bean altogether, which is referring to this particular bean class. Okay, but it has no relationship with this one. So ideally, even if you remove it, since it's not getting used anywhere, it should not throw any error. Okay, so that is the idea. Here if you see, you are using this anonymous bean and getting setting all the necessary details. So this address object has this is it. It has line 1, line 2, city, state, zip, etc. And you are trying to set those values whatever is necessary from here. Okay. Now I want to illustrate about inner beans, and that's the reason I chose this example. But there is other way also. That's if you have a customer bean, you can select it like this. Okay, in constructor arg, you can go ahead and put the index as say 0, and then from here you can refer to the other bean which you have. The bean is the address bean. You can refer it like this. There is no need to create a separate inner anonymous inner bean. So this is what you normally do, even if the bean has even if the bean does not have a separate existence outside. So the address bean is not something which you'll be accessing separately. Then there is no need to create a separate bean for it. So, but even though if it has even if the requirement is that sort, we still go ahead and use it like this in normal enterprise world, okay, just for the sake of simplicity. But the Spring gives you the chance, it gives you the option, okay, of using this bean and defining anonymous inner beans without any IDs. So in this case, every time if you try to create an object, I mean, it will like create a new instance of this bean, and there is no ID associated with it. Okay, so this is a point which I wanted to illustrate. Now, there is a third thing which I wanted to show here, but before I move forward, are there any questions? Are there any questions? Okay, so I assume no. Let's move on to the next one. Now here what I wanted to show was that if you have a bean question, okay, bean ID doesn't work there. I mean, since you're not referring to an already existing bean, it's an anonymous bean, so it's always I mean a new bean is there without any reference to an already existing bean. So there is no bean ID association with it. When you have a bean ID, it actually means that there are other beans in this particular application context which you are referring, but in this case that is not the point. Here we are creating a new bean every time, and there is no reference to the already existing address bean. So that's why there is no bean association for customer. Oh, you are asking about this one. What is the question? I'm sorry. Explain it, but I thought. Okay, so bean ID, the way it works is, see, you are creating a bean ID customer 2, and you are referring to a different bean. So if you write like this, customer arg index is equal to 0, ref is equal to address, it basically means reference is that of address bean. So when you are creating the customer instance, at that time itself, I mean, at that time itself, like say if you come here, we know that the constructor for the customer object, it accepts an address object as well. So if you see here, this customer class has another constructor with address, right? And here where the address is getting set. So when you are here at this time you give the reference as address, it means that this particular bean which is mentioned here, its instance has to be used as one of the constructor arguments for the customer bean. So that is how it works. Is it clear, Shaila? Yeah, I'm sorry I misunderstood your question earlier. Okay. Now, coming back to the next part, which is this particular bean.
Abhishek,
Yeah.
as per the customer one is there, for that, I, uh, I thought you said we don't need to declare the above that bean ID equal to address. Without that also we can do.
Yes, this is not required. This is, I mean, this is For a different, like something of this sort, it is required for customer 2. For customer 1, it is not required. So if you go here and comment it out, this is not going to cause any problem. So we'll go here in app and we'll uncomment this part. Okay, and run it again. So here if you see that address constructor, because I have mentioned here in this one calling address constructor, that one gets called and the address is set. So a new object would get created, and you can obviously print it also and see whether it has or not. See what is set in that particular bean, that is obviously set in the constructor. I mean in the attributes of the class constructor.
Can you go a little bit down?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Is it clear now? Okay. So let's move on to the next one. The next one here is that I wanted to illustrate was there is another bean question. Now if you see this question bean, let me open the class also. Uh, it's accepting a map. So we have dealt with other ways, but what about map or other collections? So just wanted to show about that one as well. So if you see here, we have the constructor arguments. The value is 11. What is Java? It means that you find a constructor which has 3 arguments. The first type is string, the second type is string, and the third type is a map. Okay, that's what it is going to look for. Okay, so say, just to confuse, even if I go and say have another constructor, okay, which only has ID and name and nothing else, right? Spring will be able to figure it out because it knows that it has to look for the constructor where it's able to find the ID. I mean this one. It's able to match on the type. So since 11 is mentioned here, and here it is an integer, if it's able to do that conversion of 11 to integer, yes, it will go ahead. So for it, the parameter is matching. The second one, which comes into picture, is this one. This is a string. There is a string. It's a perfect match. Here it is map. Here it is. Uh, Here it is map. So it will go for this particular constructor. So any other constructor like this one, it will not get used. Okay. So what we do here is we have this map, and then we define all the entries which are there in that particular map. So entry in a map is with key and value, right? So here you define the key as Java is a programming language, value is Ajay Kumar, what is platform, John Smith, Java is an island, Raj Kumar. This is just a sample set of values, the entry, key and value pairs which I have defined here. Why? Because this is a question, right? So we have question, we have answer. So that kind of stuff which we have stored. And when you go here and execute this particular part, context.getBean. Now here it gets instantiated. I think since we have not defined the scope, it will get instantiated when you are creating the application context, which in other words is same as creating the IOC container, and then the display info will get called. So let's execute it and see. See here the display info is displaying everything, the question ID, name, and the answers which was there. Okay, so this was actually able to traverse the map which we have saved, which we have defined in the application context, and set it appropriately in the question bean. So that was the idea of showing this particular example. So this is one example which I have come with. I think by now you should have ideally created something of this sort yourself, but you have not. I'll send you this piece of code, and you can look into it and like practice from your own end. The practicing is very important here because the concepts are not hard. Only thing is that unless you practice, you will not be able to assimilate in your mind how does it work. So this is one Spring example. The other one is AOP, which I created. Yes. So it's here. So last class we discussed about aspect-oriented programming also. Okay. Now this aspect-oriented programming, which was there, which was basically meaning that to allay or to mitigate your cross-cutting concerns, you can define the Spring Beans in a way. You can define the Spring Bean, and it's not related to Spring. This AOP is aspect-oriented programming. It's a separate feature altogether. It has a separate language structure, and if you import that jar, you can use it in different applications, in Java application with or without Spring. But Spring provides you a way to support it from its own end. So you do not need to write the aspect-oriented programming syntax. You can still use the way in which you define your Spring application, and Spring internal will make that call for you. So in a way, Spring makes it very easy for developers. It's sort of plug and play environment which is available to you for use. Okay. Now let's see what I have done. So again, let's go back to this pom.xml. What all is defined here. Okay. Yes, so let's go below. The only thing which is defined here is Spring, and for cglib is the one which is required for AOP. That's what we have defined here. Nothing else is required. Now coming back to SRC main, this one, SRC main resources, application context. Now here, let's go one by one. We'll not get bogged down by all the beans which are there. So here we have one address service proxy. Okay. Now this address service proxy is the one which is important. So Spring, what was AOP? So AOP was to allay or to reduce or to mitigate the cross-cutting concerns. Now what that means is that, say if you want to do logging, and that like say logging of request and response web service XMLs. So if that is a requirement, right? So if that is a requirement, how do we go about it? So if we, one way is to code in every place wherever you want to log the request and response, or the one way is that you define a common piece of code and call it from every place. But again, if, still the calling part is there. What we can do is that we can define the common piece of code, and we can also configure that when that particular method gets called, we also have to call this logging part. So that thing we can define. So in this way, the thing is that if tomorrow you find 5 new methods which has to be from where you need to log this request and response, you can just go ahead and define in this particular XML that from all those 4 places also you want to run the logging, run the logging code, and then it works. So that kind of definition is possible. So if you see this address service proxy, this is a Spring Bean, and this is a Spring class which supports AOP. And what we have defined is that which is the bean around which we have to around which we have to execute the AOP concept. The bean here is address service, which is defined on the top here. Okay, so this is a normal Pojo. I mean, it's an address service. It has city, state, zip. Apart from that, it has address line 1, address line 2, and then you have interceptor names. So interceptor name is hijack around method bean, and what it does is, let's go above. So it is also a bean, and it's a normal bean. It's a hijack around method class. Okay, so you'll see both address service and this hijack around method and see how it works. So yes, so hijack around method is like, say what we like, this is a method interceptor. Okay, and this method interceptor, it comes from, I mean, this is one of the what do you say, classes available in the CGlib. It's related to AOP. What it means that you have to implement this interface, and by the way in which you have configured, it will get called either before the method, after the method, or both before and after the method. Okay, so whatever I've done here, it basically is for both before and after. So both before and after. So what is done here is, see, maybe we are having method in what we're doing is, see, this is the actual method name. So when you are doing, and if we go here and see, the main class which I have defined. So what we have done here is that we have again loading that application context and loading this address service proxy. Now this address service proxy, let's load the first one because this is what we are looking into. Okay, and then run it. Okay, now if you see here, whatever is printed, we are getting this before method is hijacked, after method is hijacked, call. So what this means is that this particular class is getting called, and whatever you have mentioned the code here, because right now we are just having the system outs to illustrate the concept, but the idea is that before this method call, whatever is there gets called, after this method called, whatever is there it gets called. So that is what is the meaning of it. And if you see this application context, how we are accessing that is, we have this address service proxy, and we always refer to this address service proxy because the Spring Bean gets called, and what it does is that it knows that it has to work around this target, which is another Spring Bean. The only thing is that before actually going here, it has to go to it through this particular bean, which is hijack around method bean. Now hijack around method bean, we have not defined anything apart from the class. So this is what we are defined. So it means that if you want to do it, if you want to put some piece of code only before the method call, you do it here, the highlighted portion. After that, the method is getting called. But if you want to call some piece of code only after the method is getting called, this is how you have to do it. So there is no way, you just directly call the method, and once you get the response, after that, whatever piece of code you want to execute, that you have to put here. So this is the benefit which AOP, the aspect oriented programming, gives it to you. So you can have different types of advices: before the method is called advice, after the method is called advice, or around the method, which basically means both before and after the method is getting called. So that is what the definition is all about. Okay, the next thing which we have to look around here is that, see, this is that whenever we are calling the add the service class, okay, we need to what do you say, we need to execute it. We need to execute this particular interceptor. So it means that if you have two methods, and we actually have in this address service, we have called two methods, get city and get state, from the app class. So every time, if you see here, this particular hijack around method is getting called, right? Here also, here also. Now, since it is getting called in both ways, it's because the way in which has been defined is a generic way. It means that whenever a method from address service class is called, at that time you have to go ahead and create this address. You have to, yeah, excuse me. So we have to go ahead and execute that particular uh, hijack. Okay, so that is what the idea is all about. But if that is not the case, you do not want to execute it for every method, you want it to execute only for a particular method, that also can be done. So as discussed in the last class, that concept is called as point cut and advice, right? So point cut is where you want to, for which methods or for in which particular case you want to execute the interceptors, and advice is basically what do you want to do in that case. And that is what I defined in this particular address service proxy. So what is defined address service proxy 1? So if you compare the definition between this one and the next one, I mean the class remains the same. You have to go through the same proxy factory bean of the Spring framework. The target remains the same, right? But the interceptor has changed. The interceptor is hijack around method bean. So let's see what it does. Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, this is not the one. This is one. So the interceptor name is changed, which is address advisor, right? And what does address advisor does? Let's look at it. So address advisor is basically defining the two things which we discussed before. One was the point cut. I mean, in which case we want to execute this interceptor, and second is that when that situation is encountered, what needs to be done, and what needs to be done is called as advice. So here we have defined the point cut, and the point cut is referring to another Spring Bean, which is address point cut. So what this does is it uses another class from Spring itself, name matched method point. It means that you can have different types of point cuts. You can match on the basis of the package name. So for all the classes in that particular package, it has to get executed. Okay, you can define that. You can define names. So there are different ways. There are different things which you can define in the point cuts. The most common ways to define the name of the methods, and to pass the name of the methods, this is how we define the property. So map name is get city. It means that for get city method name, we want to execute this particular advice. So coming back here, what is the advice? Advice is hijack around method bean. So the advice remains the same. It was the same advice which I used earlier, but I want to use it only in the case of a particular point cut. And if I refer to that point cut, it means that only executed for a particular method, not for all the methods. So if I go here and instead of loading address service proxy, if I load address service proxy 1, right, and execute it. So if you see here, we have two methods from here, get city and get state. Okay. Now if you see, now from get city is only one where that hijack is happening, right? Get state, the hijack is not happening, even though that call was there. Why that is so? Because I mean we have defined, because of the point cut which we have defined. So I just included this example to give you an overview on Spring AOP as well, because In last class I thought that people were it was difficult for people to understand the AOP concepts, so that's why I included it. That is what I had for AOP. Any questions? Any questions, guys? Okay. So I think what I will do is that I'll forward you both of these source code which I have for Spring Beans and Spring AOP. This is what I had for today's class, and this is what we discussed. So in the last class what we did was that we discussed on the theory element, and many people were absent from that class as well. So if you have any problems, please go through the last class video as well. I have purposely made it smaller into a number of pieces so that it's easier for you. You can look into some specific parts which you're looking for as well. So you can look into it and then look into the source codes, and by going through both of them you should get a fair amount of idea as to what the Spring basic concepts, IOC, etc. stand for. So please do that. In the next class we'll start with the Spring controller. Is that fine, guys? Are you comfortable with the Spring concepts discussed till now?